Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, and Senators. Jessica Peters with the Legislative Analyst Office. A couple of weeks ago, our office released this report, which is our sort of high-level summary of the major features of High-Speed Rail's draft 2016 business plan, as well as the major issues that we have identified for you to consider. I believe you have a copy of this report in your packets. We've also put together a handout that looks sort of like this that you should have in your packet as well. And this handout is really just summarizing and pulling out some of the main highlights from our report, and that's what I'll be walking through today as I make my presentation. On page 1 of the handout, we just have an overview of what we will talk about in the presentation. We provide some background information on the high-speed rail project, identify the major changes proposed in the draft business plan, and the major issues for legislative consideration. On page 2 and 3 of the handout, we have some background information on the cost, scope, and schedule of the high-speed rail system from the prior business plans. And this information is important because the changes in the draft 2016 business plan are relative to these prior approved figures. And so I think many of them have been touched on already. I'll walk through the key ones very quickly. On page 2, we have just written down for you some of the key criteria of Prop 1A that the authority has already spoken about. We also have the prior cost and schedule estimate for completion of phase 1 of the system, the San Francisco to Anaheim line. Previously in 2012 and 2014, the authority had estimated that the entire phase 1 system would cost $68 billion and that it would be complete in 2028. Some additional background information for you on page 3 of the handout. In the 2012 and 2014 business plans, the authority planned, as you heard, for the initial operating segment to go south from Merced into the Los Angeles Basin. This initial operating segment, or IOS, was at the time estimated to cost $31 billion in capital costs and be completed by 2022. Initial construction on this segment began in the Central Valley. Also, the construction is pursuant to certain federal funding agreements. This initial segment was initially going to extend 130 miles from Madera to an area north of Bakersfield and was going to cost $5.9 billion. The authority previously has received some funding for the project, including a total of $8.1 billion that have been provided to it, 3.7 from Proposition 1A funds that the legislature has appropriated to the authority, $3.5 billion in federal funds also that have been appropriated, and about $850 million in cap and trade auction revenues estimated through the end of the current year. In addition, as you know, the legislature has provided a 25% of cap and trade auction revenues continuous appropriation on an ongoing basis, and that will provide additional funding in the future to the extent those revenues are available. Turning to page 4 of the handout, the major features of the plan. As the authority has already discussed, one of the biggest changes in the plan is switching the initial operating segment from that previous iOS South now to an iOS North, connecting an area north of the city of Shafter in the Central Valley to downtown San Jose. You can see on the map we compare the two initial operating segments. The darker, thinner, shaded line from San Jose stopping sort of in between the Kings Tulare and Bakersfield stations would be the initial operating segment that they are currently planning. Hopefully you can see it on your map. The thicker, lighter shaded line from Merced into Los Angeles was what the authority had previously planned, and the dashed line in the middle of the map is the area that's currently under construction. This is the initial construction segment in the Central Valley. The iOS North that is proposed in the draft business plan would be a 239-mile segment. In its first year of operation, which the authority estimates to be 2025, they estimate that it would carry between 2.2 and 4.1 million passengers. The reason for the change in the operating segment is because the authority did not have sufficient funding to build the previously approved iOS South. Page 5 of the handout, the next major feature that we want to highlight for you in the business plan, and I think the authority did a good job of describing this already, so I'll just point you to the chart, is this is updating their cost and schedule for the entire Phase 1 system. As they noted already, the total cost estimate is $64.2 billion, and we provide in a chart there the breakdown of the different components, $7.3 billion for the initial construction segment, $13.4 billion to complete the initial operating segment to San Jose, $2.9 billion for the extension that they've discussed to Bakersfield as well as San Francisco, and $40.6 billion for the remainder of Phase 1. On page 6 of the handout, I want to point out the last two major features of that we would like to highlight for you. The plan identifies full funding for the proposed iOS North. Specifically, the plan identifies about $28 billion in funds for this initial operating segment. This includes $6.8 billion from Proposition 1A. $4.2 billion of this has not been appropriated to the authority, and this would require legislative action to do so. $3.2 billion in federal funds. These are the same funds that have already been appropriated. And the plan assumes $17.8 billion in cap and trade auction revenues through the year 2050. This includes $5.3 billion through 2024 that would be used to fund the project on a pay-as-you-go basis, and about $13 billion from 2025 through 2050. And those future cap and trade revenues would actually be securitized under their plan and brought forward in order to fund construction costs in the nearer term. Of the $12 to $13 billion for financing, about $5.2 billion would be financing proceeds, and the remaining $7 to $8 billion would be used to pay financing costs on the project. And the last major feature of the plan is that it assumes that additional funding will become available to complete Phase 1 of the system. As we show in the previous chart, once the initial operating segment is completed, the authority would have about $44 billion in additional costs in order to complete the rest of the Phase 1 system. The business plan does not identify a full funding plan to complete Phase 1 of the project. The authority in the business plan, they do discuss certain potential revenue sources, such as securitizing operating revenues from the system when they get an operable segment, as well as they discuss, as they had presented earlier, seeking additional federal funds for the project. On page 7 of the handout, we have the first major issue for your consideration. And this is that the business plan has some uncertainties regarding the Phase 1 funding plan. I'll talk about this in two separate components. First is uncertainties relative to the funding plan for the initial operating segment north, or the valley-to-valley line, as the authority is calling it. I think first we want to say that the potential for having a full funding plan of this segment is greater than some of the previous business plans that the authority has put together. They have identified funding sources, but there is some uncertainty. About half of the revenues that they are counting on in the plan to fund the construction of the iOS North would come from cap and trade auction revenues after the year 2020. Current law does not appear to authorize the program beyond that time, and so there is, at a minimum, some significant legal uncertainty regarding the availability of those funds. I think, in our view, we think the legislature would need to take an action to extend the program in order to make those funds available. We think that as you're considering cap and trade, you're going to want to evaluate that program based on the merits of that program as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to the extent that you do approve that program to continue, then the funds could be available for high-speed rail as well as other purposes. If this legal uncertainty is resolved, we also think that additional steps would need to be taken by the legislature in order to facilitate the type of cap-and-trade securitization that the authority discusses in its business plan. I think our comments on this are similar to what the peer review group has said, so I won't go into that again, but I think we have the same views in terms of needing to have additional legislative action there in order to facilitate that. The second piece of the funding uncertainty is relative to the remainder of Phase 1. The authority does not have a complete funding plan to finish building out Phase 1. And if under their business plan, they would essentially exhaust all of the money that they have identified in order to build the initial operating segment north, leaving a roughly $40 billion, $44 billion funding gap to complete the remainder of the system. We think that it is essential that the authority develops a comprehensive and credible plan for building out the remainder of the Phase 1 system. And understanding the funding risks is going to be an important issue for the legislature to consider as you continue to review this plan. On page 8 of the handout, the next issue that we want to highlight for your consideration is the scope of the initial operating segment. First, you'll need to weigh the trade-offs of the proposed scope change. The initial operating segment south that was previously proposed would have traveled into a much more populous region of the state and had higher projected ridership. On the downside, the authority does not have the funding to complete that. And so to the extent that the legislature wants to ensure the continued development of a high-speed rail system, we think that the scope change makes some sense because it's much more likely that the authority could put together a full funding package to actually meet the cost of this iOS North. And primarily that's because the capital costs of that are about $10 billion less than the previously proposed iOS South. If the legislature agrees with this scope change, you're going to want to consider that in concept, if you agree, you're going to want to consider that the specific changes that are made, that the initial operating segment would have some standalone value. As I said before, the authority would exhaust all identified funding sources in order to build this initial operating segment. And so it's $30 billion, and you're going to want to ensure that the scope of this is something that meets your priorities, and that is something that has standalone value and makes sense on its own to the extent that the authority is not able to complete Phase 1 of the system on the schedule that they have identified. In particular, we think you may want to consider whether or not the southern terminus as proposed by the authority makes sense. It does not appear to us to be a very effective approach, as the rail line would end in an agricultural area north of the city of Shafter. The specific location, not the city of Shafter, but the specific location where the rail line would actually end, does not have the types of facilities that train passengers would need. Parking structures and transit connections, rental car facilities, businesses, a place for train passengers to get a cup of coffee, those sorts of things are just not there at that location. And so you may want to consider directing the authority to limit work beyond the last permanent southern station, which is the Kings Tulare station near Hanford. You may also want to make it a priority to identify the funding to extend the line into Bakersfield. You have options there, and that's something that you may want to put some focus into and not necessarily just go with the current version of the authority's plan and having it stop at its current southern terminus. And on page 9 of the handout, the last issue is just ensuring that there's adequate legislative oversight of the project. I think we share some of the views of the peer review group on this, just in terms of the importance of having ongoing and robust oversight. The one thing that we wanted to really point out is that in terms of the legislature doing oversight, you need information that you can compare over time to understand and track changes on the project. And one of the challenges that we've noticed is that the way the information is presented to the legislature from one business plan to the next or from one legislative report to the next, it can be very challenging to understand when there's a change reported in cost or schedule, why that is the case, because there's so many moving parts. And an example that I'll give is for the initial construction segment. So I said earlier, when that segment was initially proposed and information was presented to the legislature, it was going to cost $5.9 billion, and it was going to be 130 miles. Now the authority is indicating that that will cost $7.3 billion, and it will be 118 miles. And it's very difficult to understand why the cost is higher and why the scope is lower and how all of those changes relate to one another without having more detailed information. And so it's really unclear to us what the reasons for the change in cost are. I think the authorities indicated this. They've also added certain elements of scope within the miles that they've been looking at doing. And so it's very difficult for you to be able to understand why these costs are changing, if it's an increase, if it's a change of scope, and to have the information you need to really hold the authority to be accountable. And so we think that you may want to consider establishing certain scopes or certain core information that you have provided in a consistent manner over time, and that we think that would really help facilitate legislative oversight of the project. Thank you for having us here today. I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.